Hello, and welcome to Storytelling for Change, featuring Earthjustice and Coyote Peterson in conversation for the Wild and Scenic Film Festival. My name is Christian Anthony, and I'm the Director of Digital Engagement at Earthjustice.
Hi there, I'm Coyote Peterson, host of the Brave Wilderness YouTube channel.
Hello, my name is Tim Preso. I'm the Managing Attorney of the Biodiversity Defense Program at Earthjustice.
I'm so excited and honored to be here moderating this conversation with Coyote Peterson, wildlife educator, wildly popular YouTuber, and the host of Animal Planet series, Coyote Peterson, Brave the Wild. I'm also very honored to be joined by a very talented lawyer, Tim Preso, who is the managing attorney of the Biodiversity Defense Program at Earthjustice. So while a lawyer from a legal environmental nonprofit and a YouTuber known for braving crazy animal bites and stings might seem like an unlikely pairing, they have a similar vision. One of Earthjustice's core values is that other living beings that share our planet have the same right to existence as we do. And that is not only critical to their survival, but ours as well. And while the law is a very powerful tool, it is only one of many tools and efforts needed to inspire conservation and the protection of our wildlife. A big part of my job here at Earthjustice is to be constantly looking for new and interesting ways to tell our stories in order to connect people with our mission, which is why I'm so in awe of Coyote Peterson's work. I remember very clearly having all the kids over here at our house a couple of years ago, and they were so excited about this guy on YouTube who was going to get bit by something called the executioner wasp.
I'm Coyote Peterson, and I'm about to enter the sting zone with the executioner wasp. Here we go.
And like so many of Coyote's encounters, I sat there thinking, this guy is so good at pain management. How does he do this?
Stop burning!
And we were so impressed that we even ended up making our own tribute videos of us getting stung by various lethal bugs and insects.
Daddy, hold this. Hello, I'm Coyote Edison, and I'm about to get stung by this tarantula here. I'm pretty nervous right now. Okay.
But after watching so many of his videos, what I really began to appreciate about Coyote is there's so much more to what he does than just getting stung and bitten. He has captured the attention of millions of young people to not just entertain them, but to also inspire them to build a deeper respect and connection for this incredible place that we call Earth.
The planet is teeming with more insect species than are known to man, and a fair share of them are armed with venomous stingers. And while I know you all enjoyed watching me squirm around on the ground in pain, I hope that you also walked away with a new sense of respect and understanding for these fascinating creatures.
I'm so fortunate and grateful to be able to moderate this discussion between Coyote and Tim and to learn how they feel about inspiring change and creating impact through their storytelling, and to learn more about some of the iconic species Earthjustice has fought to protect over the last 20 years and how we will continue to protect them. Coyote, can you start us off by sharing how you got into wildlife filmmaking?
Yeah, absolutely, Christian. Getting into the world of wildlife filmmaking is a huge feat for anybody that starts out their career and says, okay, I want to get into entertainment. And then how do you possibly mix that with animals in the outdoor? Because those are two very big mountains to try to climb. So for quick context, my background specifically is in screenwriting, producing, and directing. I got a degree from The Ohio State University, and upon graduating, I knew that I wanted to make movies, but I also loved animals. And when my team and I started conceptualizing a number of different ways to bring animals to the forefront of entertainment, we just really started practicing, to be honest, going out into the wild with cameras, figuring out what would work, what didn't work. We launched Brave Wilderness in September of 2014, but there was solid 5 years of development before we ever landed on YouTube. And that was a crazy road of going down, trying to develop TV shows, everybody telling us this wasn't going to work. people interacting with animals, it's too dangerous. Like, we've got these long lenses now that we can see animals from a great distance. Maybe you consider going that direction. But we certainly felt that the inspiration that myself and a lot of my team had grown up with, people like the late, great Steve Irwin, Jeff Corwin, Marty Stauffer, Jack Hanna, these are all guys that got into the environment and were physically interacting with the animals. So we knew there was still a great potential for that style of entertainment and animal education mixed together to be viable. So lo and behold, we finally launched on YouTube in 2014, and the rest has honestly kind of been like a roller coaster ride. It was in 2016 that the bite and sting content that you mentioned managed to go viral for us, which was just, lo and behold, the craziest thing, because any good wildlife presenter will tell you that the name of the game is to not be bitten and stung by stuff. So we found out that this is exactly the kind of edutainment that people really wanted to pay attention to. We realized we had lightning in a bottle and just ran with it. But for as many bites and stings as I may do, which of course drives up the big views, we also do easily 80% more of our content centered around conservation and just strictly education. But as you mentioned earlier, the aspect of working in the right amount of entertainment to keep the audience hooked was a very important piece to the entire start to our journey. And it's something that we still hold on to today. Proud to say the Brave Wilderness turns 10 years old this year. And boy, do we have some wild stuff in the works.
So one of the videos that I watched earlier and was really drawn to was your search for the Wolverine. Can you talk a little bit about the creative process there and sort of what drove you? And clearly it was a very deeply personal project as well.
Yeah, the Wolverine episode and how that came to fruition was a very important, I'd say a pivotal point in my career as an aspiring wildlife presenter.
My path in life had landed me here, on the search for an animal so elusive that they are only ever seen at a glance, as a flash of fur in the underbrush or a shadow moving out of focus that you barely happen to catch from the corner of your eye. To encounter a wolverine in the wild is next to impossible, but for me, part of the dream was to at least try.
The Wolverine is an animal that I have absolutely adored since I was a little kid. I remember the first library book that I opened up that had a Wolverine in it. And I said, what is this crazy thing? It's like a badger meets a wolf meets a bear. And apparently it's like one of the largest members of the mustelid family. And I, at that point in time, back in the 80s, that kind of reveals my age a little bit there, coming across anything Wolverine oriented was very few and far between. But as we began to develop Brave Wilderness, one of our big goals was like, how do we ever get out there and film Wolverines in the wild? And I can tell you, that's next to impossible unless you've got a really long time to spend out essentially hiding as a human within the environment, hoping that one of these nomadic creatures wanders across your lens. But we had the opportunity to work with a wonderful conservationist and animal expert named Steve Kroschel, who had a wildlife sanctuary in Haines, Alaska. And we convinced Steve to let us come up, film an episode with a wolverine he had raised from kit to full adulthood. And I then became, after several days of going through wild conditioning that Steve put me through, I became the first wildlife show presenter to enter an enclosure with an unharnessed wolverine. It's very important to note unharnessed. So this is just me and the wolverine, like we were in a coliseum together.
I made contact with the wolverine, and today you helped me realize a dream that I've had since I was 8 years old. And I don't know how I could ever thank you enough for what today was. And all those kids out there that just watched this episode that experienced and got to see a wolverine for the first time, and you helped me do that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey, I'm going to hug you.
Yes!
That was...
And once we had finished filming, I promised Steve that this episode was going to become the most watched piece of Wolverine edutainment ever created. And to this day, I think the episode's somewhere around 15 million views. I'm still in very close contact with Steve all the time. And our ability to bring Wolverines on this level of education and entertainment to the world was something that was very meaningful for us. And strangely enough, this episode was produced before all of the crazy bite and sting stuff that sent Brave Wilderness viral. But for us, getting to share an animal as unique as the Wolverine with the world was a huge accomplishment, not only career-wise, but also as one of those bucket list items, a dream item where you're like, wow, this was my favorite animal as a kid, and now here I am getting the chance to work with it.
And I was also struck that you brought a Wolverine with you, a stuffed Wolverine that your mother made.
Yeah, actually, you know what? That Wolverine is actually right here on this shelf. Yeah, this Wolverine, this is Gulo. My mother made this for me when I was in first grade, right in the heart of like, man, any Christmas present in the world was an amazing Christmas present. Probably the first ever stuffed Wolverine that was created.
And hopefully today.
You got one here.
Yes, this is my
It's not
Wolverine.
alive, though.
No, this is not as alive as the Wolverines you're used to. And I told myself if I ever actually make it to Alaska to see a Wolverine, Gulo is coming with me.
And we did. I brought this Wolverine to Alaska. We actually have footage and photos of Banff, the Wolverine that we worked with, playing with the stuffed Wolverine. So for me, that was just a little extra cherry on top of the whole experience.
That's amazing. And can you talk a little bit about the impact that your videos have, like in terms of what you see in the comments and how people reach out to you? And just how your audiences resonate with your material.
Each and every episode has an interesting impact on the audience. And the audience is incredibly diversified. And when people ask, well, what is your age range? We kind of jokingly say 4 to 104 because we make content that is appropriate for absolutely everybody. And while we do make sure that it is family and brand friendly so that kids specifically can enjoy it, we really put a level of production into our work and the style of action, the editing, the music, all these things to make it completely palatable for an older generation as well. And our goal with all of it, honestly, at the end of the day, is to get people excited about animals that they may not know much about, or something they might be afraid of, something that's, masked in legend and lore. And for us, it's all about dispelling a number of falsehoods or myths around specific species so that we look at them in a different light, a more positive light, to ensure that people are then protecting these species moving into the future. And I know we're going to talk more about influence on the next generation, but getting kids involved in wanting to protect animals and the planet very early on, we feel is incredibly important for the longevity of different species survival on our planet.
That's great. Thank you. So Tim, before we get into the Wolverine and protection, can you talk a little bit about your path to becoming an environmental lawyer?
Sure. I grew up in a rural part of the Pacific Northwest and was always interested in wildlife and the outdoors from a recreational perspective, and then worked as a journalist for a while and started covering some of these issues. And it pretty quickly dawned on me that those undeveloped places on the map weren't just an accident, that they existed today because past generations had stood up to say, this is a place that we have to protect and leave to future generations. And as I started to dig more deeply, it was over and over again a situation where the law had played a key role in keeping our wild places wild and preserving our wildlife for our kids and our grandkids. And as I started looking at that, I realized that this is what I want to do. I want to be part of that. I want to use the law in a way that can make a difference for all the creatures and places that don't have a voice. Dr. Seuss's Lorax talks about that he speaks for the trees have no tongues. And, that's a story we all read as a kid, but it's very much a real feature of the way our political system works and our legal system works. Unless we speak up for those places and those species, nobody will. And so that's kind of been the course of my career, was to try to use the law and in the legal system be that voice for those things that can't speak on their own.
And can you talk about protecting the Wolverine? I know that this is a case that's gone on for many, many years, and what that looked like and what was achieved.
Well, when I was watching Coyote's excellent Wolverine video, I noted he was talking about the Wolverine as a spirit of persistence that never gives up. And, we had to adopt some of that toughness and tenacity of the Wolverine to be able to get really important legal protections for the Wolverine. Wolverines are really tough. They are a species that can make a living in the harshest mountain landscapes, but they also are in many ways very vulnerable. In the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they were heavily trapped and poisoned as part of predator control campaigns, almost entirely wiped out in the lower 48 states. And then when those, campaigns ramped down and there started to be more room for them, there was a very slow, gradual recolonization of historic habitat by wolverines coming from Canada. But then, Wolverines really are about snow and cold and big wild places. And all of that is getting harder and harder to come by in our modern world. And so when the Wolverines came back to the US, they found a warming climate. They found, more trapping, and Montana at that time had a wide open trapping season for Wolverines and a hostile landscape. And it was pretty clear that without some additional protections, we weren't going to have Wolverines in the lower 48. It was going to be like, a species that maybe you could go to Alaska or the Yukon and see, but you're never going to have an opportunity to be around a Wolverine or even to experience a place where a Wolverine lives in the lower 48 unless we do something. And one of the great things about our Federal Endangered Species Act that we have in the USA is the public can step up to demand new protections for a species. And in 2000, members of the public did that for the Wolverine. But, that law is just words on paper unless it's enforced. And so that petition to provide protections for the Wolverine kicked off a process that's governed by the law. And in October of 2002, we filed our first legal case to try to force the government to provide new legal protections for the Wolverine. And little did we know that it would take 21 years and 6 lawsuits to finally get across the finish line. But just at the end of last year, we finally got a decision from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that said that Wolverines are now protected under the Endangered Species Act. That means there can't be more trapping. That means recovery programs can come into play. That means there'll be new scientific research to help understand and protect the species. So it was a tremendous result, and it was a tremendous amount of work to get there. But it just shows, as the Wolverine has shown us, persistence pays off.
I have to ask, how did that make you feel after so many years to get to that place?
Well, obviously, tremendous celebration, tremendous victory, but also a sense of hope for the future of Wolverines and wildness and wild places, and that we still have a system that cares about and protects those things as long as we, the public, will step up and be loud and be clear that those kinds of things need to be protected.
And I'm curious, Coyote, having met a Wolverine, sort of how does that story make you feel?
It's absolutely thrilling. If something that obscure like Wolverine can get this sort of protection, means that all animals on our planet can get the protections they're needed. And when you're talking about the Wolverine specifically, this is an incredibly important predator. And once they start to rebound, if you get the chance to see a Wolverine in the wild, that's one of my dreams. But for anybody that's seen one, that's like kind of seeing a unicorn in some regards, right there up with it. So yeah, I think the work that Tim and his team have done to get these protections for Wolverines is one of the greatest conservation success stories in the past quarter century, for sure.
Another animal in need of protection is the gray wolf, which is one of the most endangered mammals in the United States, and also has a powerful narrative behind it. Their recovery was halted in 2020 after the Trump administration delisted the gray wolf following 45 years of protection under the Endangered Species Act. Tim, can you tell us a little bit about that case?
The Endangered Species Act is really at bottom kind of a bill of rights for the other creatures with which we share this planet. And in terms of species that need that protection, wolves are at the top of the list. The culture that many of us, brought to North America from Europe is one that has viewed the wolf as an adversary. And, we Europeans brought that set of beliefs with them to this continent and set about to persecute wolves. And it was really only in the 1970s, 60s or so that different attitudes started to emerge. But even to this day, wolves inspire incredible passions. On the one hand, there's incredible love of wolves and they capture the imagination, and there are people who are huge fans of wolves. And literally, if you go to Yellowstone National Park and you drive out through the Lamar Valley and you see all the people on the side of the road with their spotting scopes who are watching the wolves, and they know every pack and all of its members and all of their family histories, and the sagas of these individual wolves are like a Game of Thrones season. There's so much drama, and that's a huge part of the wolf story. But another huge part of the wolf story is the continuing persecution. Wolves continue to inspire hatred and antagonism and persecution that goes beyond any other species in my experience. And so without the Endangered Species Act, we would not have anything resembling a wolf population in its historic range in the lower 48 for sure. Beginning in the 1990s, we got involved in advocating for the program that reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park in central Idaho. Since then, there has been, a series of battles over whether wolves should continue to have protections, how those protections should be applied, whether recovery should proceed in other parts of the country, and whether the rug should be pulled out from wolves in terms of any kind of federal protections. And we've had that issue come up again and again. And just recently, the past presidential administration had issued a decision that removed federal protections for wolves nationwide, except for a reintroduced Mexican wolf population in a limited area of Arizona and New Mexico. But the rest of the country, there were no protections in place from the federal government for wolves as a result of that decision. And that means in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, where there's been some recovery and there's been a significant wolf population has now taken hold, they were suddenly subjected to really intensive hunting, including a pretty poorly managed hunting season in Wisconsin that blew way past the state set quota and killed a whole bunch of wolves in a short amount of time. And so one of the most recent things we've done on behalf of wolves was we challenged that decision to remove national level protections for them. And we were successful in getting a court to say that decision had not taken account of the best available science and had to be reconsidered. And that's a key thing about the Endangered Species Act, is that it requires the government to follow the best available science. In a lot of things we deal with as citizens of this country, we're subject to politics. And, that can just boil down to who has the, one more vote than the others. In the Endangered Species Act, the law says that the decisions under that act have to be governed by the best available science. So the science controls, but again, those are words on paper unless they're enforced. So we've had to be the enforcer again and again to make sure that science prevails in the management of wolves.
Coyote, I know you too have a deep connection with the wolves. Can you tell us about that?
Wolves are, another one of those species that as a kid I was really fascinated with. And, to Tim's point, wolves are often pointed as this adversarial bad guy in a lot of, media content. And you name me a movie where there's a wolf and that wolf is anything other than the bad guy. I mean, when have we ever seen a wolf as a good guy, really? And it's that sort of fear that is planted as these seeds of entertainment in generations upon generations of entertainment absorbers that has given us this negative connotation of what these animals are. And certainly they move in packs, they have teeth, they could look scary, they can be snarly, but these are important balancers of the ecosystem. And with a number of wolves that have essentially been decimated, it's now causing what would be considered prey species, large ungulates like mule deer and elk, to have their populations just bloom out of control. And certainly you've got conflict in some of the, Western states because you've got cattle ranchers who've got their livestock out in these areas that wolves would naturally be inhabiting. But at the end of the day, wolves aren't going to necessarily go out of their way to try to take out cattle. So there's, again, a lot of opportunity for people to shine a negative light on what a wolf may be, or a wolf pack might, how a wolf pack might impact an environment. But the more we can educate people about the positives wolves are doing, the better the chance we have of changing that narrative and ensuring that they're protected into the future.
And Tim, can you talk a little bit about the connection between using the law and being in court and changing that narrative and how they work together?
I mean, all of these controversies about wolves can be learning moments, or teaching moments, really, to talk about the role that wolves play in the ecosystem and to really make clear some of the points that Coyote just addressed about wolves. But the law is only one tool for conservation, and ultimately the law is only as good as the public sentiment that underlies it. The law is an expression of the views of the public, and without the public support, the law is a limited tool. And so, yes, it's important that the Endangered Species Act be enforced. It's important that wolves get the legal protections that they need. But to make that happen, it's not just about winning a lawsuit. It's also about having public support, having a more enlightened public attitudes, maybe changing some of those attitudes that make it so important to have the law as a backstop for wolves. Maybe making it a more accepting environment for wolves, and having people understanding more about their role in the ecosystem. And that's why programs like Coyotes and all the other efforts that are going into making people understand how predators and prey species interact in the environment. It's not the good guys versus the bad guys. It's a complex interacting system. Those things are super important to start to change some of those attitudes and erode some of that hostility and persecution and make the world a safer place for wolves and lots of other species.
Coyote, I know earlier in his administration, you had a chat with President Biden about wolves. Can you tell us how that came about?
Certainly getting the chance to speak to President Biden was a huge honor. And at the time, we were thick in the middle of COVID, and YouTube had approached us and said, hey, we want to speak to a handful of creators to, help support the idea, the science behind the vaccine, and how was a team like ours, which travels typically internationally, what were the struggles that we were facing with the limitations of what COVID essentially allowed us to do or not allowed us to do based on how we produce our content. And very quickly, we actually kind of skewed off of any conversation about COVID. And the whole thing ended up turning into a conversation about wolves, because President Biden's grandchildren, and he had watched the For the Love of Wolves episode that we did.
What if I told you that everything you thought you knew, that everything you feared about wolves, was nothing more than a poorly written narrative constructed over 100 years ago? Think about that. What if the story has been wrong the entire time? Consider this. Of the 100 million cattle raised in the United States every year, do you know how many fall prey to wolves? 0.01%. Do you want to know how many humans have been killed by wolves in the past century? 2. This planet needs wolves more than any of us will ever understand. And most of us will never do a single thing to edit the wrongful narrative that has been written. Are you afraid of the big bad wolf? If so, go and visit the Colorado Wolf and Wildlife Center. I challenge you to face your fears, and I promise you will walk away with a newfound respect and a feeling in your heart that can only be achieved once you've looked into the eyes of a wolf.
I was blown away to know that President Biden had seen our work on Brave Wilderness, but we got into a pretty meaningful conversation about why it's important for these animals to remain here. So to hear his support for the idea that we do need to protect these species for the future, he looks at his grandkids and he says, this is the future who's going to get to admire and see these things in the wild. And Tim, you brought up an important point, or an interesting point, I should say, about like the packs out in Yellowstone. They're a massive tourist draw. You can go to Yellowstone and you're guaranteed to see elk. But if you go to Yellowstone and drive through and you have the chance to see one of the wolf packs, that's amazing. It's something that you're never going to forget. So, President Biden recognizing something like that, important people in politics recognizing that these are the things that are becoming staples for people's experiences when they go out into our national parks or their state parks, whatever it might be, to be able to go out there looking for something and hope to have an encounter with something that's incredibly special. And wolves definitely check off that box of being something that's incredibly special. Aside from what they're doing to help balance the ecosystem, they're doing a lot of good for us as humans because they're bringing us in and drawing us to the parks, which of course, and then is its own self-sustaining system as well. So going, not to tangent off too far there, but, getting political leaders behind the idea of protecting animals like this is incredibly important. And the work that Tim is doing, using, legal routes to get protections, it's all tied together at the end of the day, because without the entertainment, without the right laws in place, you don't have this sort of conjunction of like-minded individuals that can build this and boost it up to a higher plateau. And the more that we get the younger generation recognizing these things, even people like President Biden to his grandkids saying, these wolves are important, they need to be there, that's what's going to reshape the future and how things are ultimately preserved for future generations to come.
We lived for thousands and thousands of years side by side with wolves, and that was part of our life throughout our lives throughout most of the history of humanity. And so, a few hundred years of technology haven't erased that. And there's something very profound and fundamental about that connection. And, it isn't, we've been talking about some of the attitudes of hostility, but there are other ways to think about wolves. For instance, in some of the work we did on wolf conservation in Wisconsin, we had the privilege of working with the Ojibwe tribes. And in their worldview, the wolf is a member of their family. It's not an antagonist. It's not a hostile force. It's a relation. And the relationship with the natural world is more like a relationship with family. And there's something we might want to think about that.
Coyote, I know that you're also working a lot of other things besides wolves and wolverines. Can you tell us about some of that?
A couple years ago, we got very involved with an initiative called Save the Horns, which is a campaign we launched to protect critically endangered black rhinos. Also excited to announce that through that campaign, along with a number of other partners and a couple of reserves that we're working with in South Africa, we just translocated 25 individuals to a new protected area that is without question going to be considered a contingency population if we don't bring rhino horn poaching to an end. And we're talking like the next 10 years. If in the next 10 years poaching is not brought to an end, specifically surrounding black rhinos, they will probably become effectively extinct in the wild as we know it. And that's a crazy thing to think about. 10 years goes by really, really quickly. And when it comes to the poaching of something like rhinos, it's done because of false medicine, false information, and these animals essentially being slaughtered for a black market trade that is just pretty absurd to people like me at this point. And I'm sure you, Tim, and anybody that's listening and watching. How do we change that narrative? How do we bring this to an end? Well, again, it all does tie back to education at the end of the day. And I won't tangent too far onto that, but the Save the Horns initiative is certainly something to us that's very important. And it's not just rhinos. It's all the animals in Africa, elephants and lions and leopards and a number of different species that just require a lot of human support to have the right protections in place. And Africa's a wild continent. I mean, everybody knows that. And whether you're in South Africa or further north, you've got animals that are protected on reserves, which will be hundreds of thousands of hectares worth of expanse and space. But that protection requires a lot of work and a lot of support. And the anti-poaching unit rangers who are on the front lines doing this work to protect these species continuously need our support from elsewhere to ensure that they're able to do their job. So Save the Horns is kind of an all-encompassing initiative that's not only protecting the animals, but it's also helping keep the humans that are defending these animals and the land itself first and foremost in their sights.
And Tim, I know you've got a lot of other work going on with the biodiversity team. Do you want to tell us about some of your other cases?
Well, we're looking at protecting some of the really key biodiversity sites that we absolutely have to save if we're going to sustain the kinds of things that we enjoyed as people who grew up in the time we're in, and to make sure that we pass those on to our kids and grandkids. And that includes the old growth forests of our national forest system. It includes some of the amazing migratory bird concentration points like the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It includes continuing campaigns to protect wolves and grizzly bears and the like. So the work is incredibly rewarding, but also never ending. And, the kind of work that Coyote described about trying to prevent the extinction of black rhinos is, I think, something to kind of give some additional thought to, because, we often hear about the slaughters of the past, the loss of 60 million bison and, the extinction of the passenger pigeon and, one thing after another. And we sort of say, how could those people have done that? But we're in this moment determining what is the record of our time. What is the legacy we're going to leave? Is it going to be extinction in the wild of black rhinos? Is it going to be, waters that are too dirty to sustain our native fish and freshwater ecosystems? Is it going to be a healthy, vibrant ecosystem with wolves and their prey living in balance? Or is it going to be a kind of a glorified zoo with big elk populations, but no predators and everything out of balance? And, we're writing that story right now. And so, what we're trying to do in this program is use the law as effectively as possible to make sure that, that record, when we look back on it, is one of progress and repairing some of the damage of the past and setting a foundation for a more productive future, rather than something that future generations will look back on and shake their heads and say, how could those people have done that?
I have someone here who wanted to ask Coyote a question real quick.
All right, let's do it.
Here, why don't you back out a little bit? This is Malloy, my son, a big fan.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I just wanted to ask, like, what is the scariest moment you've had with animals?
Ooh, wow. Scariest moment I've had with animals. Well, I try to not usually create scary scenarios, but they do happen, in all fairness. So I'll tell one that's rather fitting. We're also working on a documentary project right now, a feature documentary film about grizzly bears and grizzly bear attacks and how to avoid that human-wildlife conflict. And I was very close to having that sort of a conflict several years ago in Alaska, the same trip for Brave Wilderness where we filmed the Wolverine episode. And we were doing a bunch of B-roll footage in the backcountry. So we'd gone way up this forest logging road, found this epic river, sort of climbed down this ravine, and we're out there. And Alaska is absolutely massive for anybody that hasn't been there. Everything's bigger. The rivers, the trees, the mountains, all of it. And we were in the middle of nowhere walking along the side of this river, which was pretty expansive. So we had a good eye view for how far in case there were any bears around. Well, sure enough, we had come across some bear tracks that looked relatively fresh. We said, okay, the team and I were like, we got to keep our head on a swivel, because what you don't want to do is accidentally spook a bear of any sort, let alone a mother with cubs. Lo and behold, we had a mother and her 4 German Shepherd-sized cubs come around this bend and straight towards us. And that's one of those crazy moments where you're like, all right, the bear clearly has not seen us yet, and it can't smell us because we were downwind moving with the flow of the river's water. So sound and smell are now working against us, and grizzly bears don't have the best sight. So when she got within about 70 yards, we made the decision with our bear spray out. We were armed, ready to go. Bear spray, most important thing you can have in any bear encounter situation. And we essentially alerted her that we were there, waving our arms in the air. Yo, bear, hey, bear, and sure enough, that caught her attention. She stood up on her back legs. And I will tell you, one of the scariest things I've ever seen in nature is a mother grizzly bear standing on her back legs within 70 yards. Now, a bear can cover 70 yards in a matter of seconds. So it was either she was going to drop down all fours and charge us, or she was going to take her cubs and go in the opposite direction. And fortunately for us, she took her cubs and went in the opposite direction. We had a pretty wild story to tell, but I would say when it comes to scary animal encounters, that one is definitely up there, because your heart is pretty much jumping out of your chest at the moment you see a grizzly bear, let alone one standing up, let alone it then making a decision to run off. So yeah, grizzly bear encounter is definitely up there. And being in the middle of nowhere didn't help the situation, because if it had gone the other way and she had chosen to attack to defend her cubs, we would have been in a very, very sticky situation. So fortunately walked away from it and lived to tell the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great question.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Coyote and to Tim and the Wild and Scenic Film Festival for taking their time out of this busy schedule and for hosting this and for letting us have this conversation. For me personally, and you could see with Malloy, it's so inspiring that you're doing this work. And Coyote, I can just see the connection you make is unbelievable. He lights up. And Tim, your dedication and your commitment and your ability to take on these cases, which do last for so long, to protect one species like the wolverine, just makes me so proud to be working at Earthjustice and a part of this work. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
And we also want to say to the audience, you can also be involved. And so one way is to make sure that our Endangered Species Act does stay strong.
If you guys want to get involved, all you need to do is text CHANGE to 43428. Let's help protect the planet and its species. And if specifically rhinos are for you, make sure to visit www.savethehorns.com and let's get these vanishing giants protected.
So that's it. Thanks so much, Coyote and Tim. Really, this was fantastic.
Thanks so much for having us. It was an excellent conversation and looking forward to the next one.